Welcome, Ken. Good
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I think probably the best place to start is where you started on the school board 4 years ago. It was just a few months after the departure of Kevin Skelly. New superintendent, new board. It probably seems like a decade ago to you, but I'm wondering how you, in looking back on these 4 years, would characterize sort of the evolution of the board in particular and of the sort of state of the management of the district as we sit here today as compared to when you came on.
I think both the board and the district's management are significantly improved from when I joined the board. In terms of the board, we have focused on improving governance. Our board meetings are, I think, much more focused. One of the things I said 4 years ago is that I wanted the board to act more like a legislative body that takes votes and acts by majority rule. We've done that. We have made progress, and there's still progress to go on things like having the board much more in control of the budgeting process, the board much more in an oversight role for key metrics that are important to students in the district. And I think if you watch our board meetings, they're more focused, they're more civil, they're more business oriented in terms of the district's business than in the past. The district's management, I think, is also improved. The new superintendent, I think, has very strong operational skills and management skills, which I think is an improvement over the past. We've also made very significant changes in other members of the senior management. So we just hired one of the best chief business officers in the state, formerly of Long Beach Unified. We have a new HR director who's also our new deputy superintendent, Karen Hendricks. Another assistant superintendent, Lana Conway, is a very strong administrator. So I think we have a more capable, more focused management team than we have had certainly since I have been engaged in the district.
It seems like one of the results of the last few years has been that the board has stepped in and gotten more involved in some management type issues than probably is typical of a school board. Do you feel first of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, do you feel that we're in the process of sort of turning a corner and now sort of realigning board and management responsibilities?
I'm not sure that it's the case that the board has been more involved in management decisions than in the past. I think that the board's primary role with regards to management is oversight and firing the superintendent. We have taken an active role, obviously, in managing the superintendent. The board's increased involvement in budgeting is really around prioritization. The finances of the district are a key aspect of the district's operations, and so it's really critical that the board be engaged there. I think in some ways we've taken a step back from the practices of previous boards in terms of getting engaged in management decisions, and I would say in a school district, they're really sort of critical management decisions that it's important for the board to avoid are educational decisions and pedagogical decisions. And I have been a very strong advocate for letting the professionals make those decisions when they are truly professional decisions. So curriculum adoptions, I tend to see as something that the board should defer to teachers on. A whole host of sort of pedagogical and educational decisions. And I think previous boards have been much more willing, and probably too willing, to get involved in substituting their viewpoint for that of the professionals who we've hired to run the schools.
Around this time last year, you and another sitting trustee, Todd Collins, publicly called for then Superintendent Max McGee's resignation. Why did you decide to take that step?
I had lost confidence in Dr. McGee's ability to effectively manage the district. And there is a range of reasons for that. The two that I'll call out as being most salient are his failure to ensure that the district's financial management was properly conducted, and I'm thinking particularly of the failure to notify the teachers union and other unions of the district's desire to renegotiate the final year of the contract. And the second was the failure to put in place a system of practices that would ensure compliance with Title IX and other anti-discrimination laws. The Cozen O'Connor report was very clear on that point. I had seen the same problems. So those combined with a range of other important but smaller issues convinced me that we needed new leadership.
Do you think the board bears any responsibility on the failure to notify the unions? I know obviously it wasn't your job to do that. It does strike me as sort of strange at the time that nobody bothered to sort of ask, how's it going with the union on that third year cancellation business? It's just hard to picture how that exactly happened.
I think in hindsight, these things seem obvious in ways that they don't, when you're in them. There's many things that have to happen in order for a school district to work well and to be compliant. And it's impossible for a board member, and inappropriate, I think, for the board to see its role as checking up to see if those things are actually done. I think the board's responsibility then, in the face of a failure like that, is to review the senior management's performance and take appropriate steps, which is what I did.
When it came to the hiring of the new superintendent, Don Austin, you voted against his contract. Can you explain to us the reasonings for that vote?
So I said at the time that I wasn't going to comment further on that. I'll note that Dr. Austin was the third white male in a row in that role. I think we could benefit from some diversity in that role, but I don't want to go further into that decision. I will say that I pledged at the time to be completely supportive of his success, which I have been. And I also have to say I'm very pleased with his performance to this point in the role of superintendent. So I think he has done a great job, and I have a lot of confidence that he's going to be an effective leader for the district.
When you ran for school board the last election, or 4 years ago, you said that you were being really specific about your campaign priorities and goals so that if you got elected, you would have sort of the backing of the voters to push those goals forward. And you particularly focused on special education, the district's relationship with the Office for Civil Rights, student mental health, the need to open a 13th elementary school, and foreign language instruction. Can you critique the board's progress over the last 4 years on, you probably can't do the whole list, but maybe the most salient ones, or ones that you feel you made progress on, and ones that stalled or didn't really move forward?
Well, so two that I didn't make progress on were a 13th elementary school, and it turned out that we didn't need a 13th elementary school because enrollments declined. And foreign language in elementary schools, which fell victim, I think, mostly to the budget situation that ensued after the teacher's contract that I voted against. We'll probably talk about that, and then the surprise in the property tax revenues. I think that areas where I feel like we have made progress, our relationship with OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, is completely turned around from one of confrontation to one of cooperation. We repealed the resolution criticizing the Office for Civil Rights and the Obama administration's civil rights enforcement. We reached a resolution agreement. We're almost done complying with that resolution agreement. And more importantly, the district's compliance is now, I think, robust, effective, not perfect. It takes time to turn a whole system, but we are night and day compared to where we were before. Catherine Lehman, who was the former Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, described Palo Alto as a model for K-12 Title IX compliance. That's just impossible to have imagined 4 years ago. Special education, We have a plan that we're executing on. We have new leadership. The board is putting funding into that. I'm not satisfied, actually, with our progress in that regard, but we are definitely on an upward trajectory. Mental health services, we've increased substantially mental health funding in the schools. We have wellness centers in our high schools. We have counselors now and therapists in the schools who are licensed rather than interns. We have made we've made progress, that is around student well-being that isn't specifically focused on mental health, eliminating zero-period at gun to produce more sleep. Anecdotally, we've made progress on the homework policy, although that's another area where I think I'm not satisfied with the progress that we've made. So by and large, I would say that we have made progress where progress was possible, and that I would have preferred faster movement on some of these items, but I'm on the whole satisfied with the progress that we've made and looking forward to making more progress in the next term.
When it comes to Title IX compliance, notwithstanding the progress that's been made, there are complaints about the burden of the reporting requirements from principals and other staff. Do you feel like there's anything that needs to be changed to address the complaints, or do you think that the board needs to take any action?
I mean, I think that there's always implementation issues, and the district can get better at those. But I think that the fundamental point to be made to the organization, and that the board really needs to continue to make, is that compliance with the law is a bottom line requirement, and difficulty in complying is a reason to address the difficulties, but not to not comply, or to comply with less vigor. Mm-hmm. So I would say we can certainly address the implementation. We cannot revisit the decision to actually do it.
Sure.
The title, before we leave Title IX, that issue and the issues surrounding sexual assault, especially at Pali, but really at both schools, one of the outcomes was a degree of alienation between the faculty, particularly at Pali, and the board, revolving around pressures, I think, that the board felt to take disciplinary action or action towards administrators that was pretty opaque to the public. But the reaction at Pali was one of defending their principal, and the ultimate outcome, of course, was Kim DiOrio leaving. I wonder, are there relationships that you think need to be repaired coming out of the last couple of years regarding teachers and administrators and the board? And if so, how does one go about trying to do that?
So I'd say a couple things. First is that discipline of staff members is a responsibility of the superintendent. So it wasn't the board's initiative to initiate the discipline that was connected with the issues in the Title IX. I also think that the Pali and the faculty and staff more broadly is not monolithic in this regard. And I think that there are a variety of different reactions in that school and across the district around this. And I can definitely understand we're talking about personal relationships, we're talking about professional relationships. People find it difficult sometimes when things happen that aren't comfortable, that they don't like. But I've also seen that the decision to appoint Adam Paulson to be the principal of Pali seems to have gone a fair ways towards reassuring the community that their leadership is connected to them and knows them. So by and large, I don't see a project that we need to engage in to rebuild bridges. I mean, I think the best thing that the board can do for faculty and staff is to administer a district, to govern a district that works well, that has as few crises as possible, that's legally compliant, and that can focus on the core job of educating students. And that's really what I've tried to do.
So are you saying that with respect to administrators below the superintendent's level that the board doesn't engage in discussions in closed session about the performance of those individuals and provide some direction to the superintendent?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that the ultimately those decisions are the superintendent's decisions, not the board's decisions. And there is discussion providing feedback to the superintendent about the performance of staff members, typically who report to the superintendent as part of the superintendent's evaluation of those individuals. And there is some review of discipline, but I think it would be inaccurate to say that the board is deciding to discipline administrators or staff members. That's really a administrative function exercised by the superintendent where the board is providing some feedback and input, but is not the primary decision maker.
So you touched upon the homework policy earlier. I just want to follow up with that. Since you've been increasingly concerned about the spotty implementation, do you think that there is something that prevented the district in this past 4 years from completely implementing it to your satisfaction? And is there something still to be done?
Oh, there's definitely something still to be done. What we don't have is metrics and feedback. So I'm convinced from talking to teachers that by and large, providing accurate feedback to teachers will go a long way towards enabling them to adjust the homework that they're giving and to coordinate with each other around homework. I think that's a big missing piece. I think I've said before that, it's like we've given people a speed limit, but we've taped over their speedometers. And so we need to provide that feedback. Now, why hasn't that happened? I think there's several reasons. One is that I don't think that Dr. McGee saw this as a priority of implementation, honestly. In that I observed that when we discussed it in, say, for example, board retreats, I had on several occasions to come back to the challenge success data on homework to kind of make the point that this really is an issue. I think it's a significant change in school practice. One of the things I've observed as a community member and now as a trustee is that it's a lot easier to make changes kind of around the edges than it is in the core of how the system is operating. And homework is kind of part of the core. And so it's not surprising that it's harder to make change there. And and also for legitimate reasons. I mean, reducing homework loads where it's needed, means that professionals have to rethink how they're doing a part of their job. There's all kinds of supports for that. There's research support for that, but it's hard professional work that needs to happen. I think the third thing is just that, and I kind of alluded to this in the past point, is when you've got crises going on, Title IX compliance and other issues that we've had, you tend to lose the ability to focus on these things that really matter, which is why it's really important to manage in a way that reduces the number of crises, and that when one comes, to get it resolved as quickly as you can, in a way that's responsible.
So do you think there are active teacher holdouts to using Schoology and pushing forward on implementation of the homework plan, or do you think that it just
in terms of
risen?
Schoology implementation, I have heard that there are a few teachers who are not using it fully, and I think I've given feedback to the superintendent that we need to address that. I'm not sure I'd call them holdouts. I would want to see how they react to getting the feedback that no, this is part of the teacher contract and this is an expectation. And similarly on homework, it's hard to say that someone's holding out when we aren't giving them the information they need to actually implement the policy. So I would certainly not want to start to accuse people who haven't had a chance to really do the job.
Do you think our high school kids are under more or less stress than they were when you emerged as a candidate 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago?
I have not seen much real change. in terms of the stress levels of high school students. I've heard anecdotally that there's a reduction in homework loads, but I haven't really seen that in the data. And part of this is that we don't have data that's super good at being continuous over this period. I can say that I'm not satisfied with the progress that we've made, and that there is still a long way to go, I think, to the point where we have schools where we can say that we really are running them in a way that protects student well-being and keeps levels of stress and anxiety and so forth at a level that is healthy and consistent with good learning.
And will the weighted GPA system that currently is in place and how that's rolled out, what decisions students have made in the context of that policy, will that help answer those questions, do you think, in terms of stress?
Well, I don't know if they'll answer the question. I mean, the questions about stress are really asking students, what are you experiencing? What is your life at school? How much sleep do you get? Those are the questions.
Right,
so
but
I think
those often are hard questions because they're calling upon the student to make their own describe their own personal feelings, which I think is just a very difficult thing to measure. But in the case of the weighted GPA, you actually have set up a system that creates some incentives, and there are arguments made that students would look past those incentives. There are arguments made that no, this is going to skew things. If the results of the use of weighted GPA is that there's less enrollment in
electives.
Electives,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
and a noticeable increase in those classes that have weighted GPA. Is that an indicator that we're moving in a further direction towards a focus on achievement, rigor, and stress?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we don't want a system that has negative consequences for students. Among those are stress, reducing choice. I mean, fewer electives means that students have fewer options. We want students to have options. More emphasis on the grade that you get means less emphasis probably on the content of what you're choosing to do. So I think it's important to look at are the incentives that we're setting up producing behavior that we think is good for students. I mean, weighted GPA is there are a variety of ways that we can address that, right? If that turns out to be the case, we can look at making elective classes have an honors option, for example, right? There's nothing, particularly magic about some set of classes and other set of classes in terms of their intellectual content and so forth. We can provide some education, I think, about what a weighted GPA really means and how colleges and universities use it, because, for most students in most cases, the weighted GPA is not relevant to their college admission or their financial aid, options. So, I don't want to get into a debate about it with folks, but I think it's important to provide, accurate information to students and families so that they can make decisions about, what matters and what doesn't matter.
There's a blunter instrument, and that would be to cap the number of classes one can take that have a weighted GPA.
I haven't heard that actual proposal. I mean, I think that what I would like to do, assuming that there's anything to be done, which I think we need to look at the data and hear from staff, is to listen to what staff recommends about what's going to produce the right set of incentives for students and what the right information to provide to students is. And if there's some change that needs to be made, we should make it.
This spring, there was an issue that I think it's safe to say took a surprising turn, and that was the renaming of schools and the division over the Fred Yamamoto name specifically. And I wanted to find out from you if you think that this division in the community or this rift is something that the school board should take any action on going forward, and if so, in what way would that happen?
Well, I mean, I think that yes, the district should take action to ensure that we have a community in our schools that is cohesive, that doesn't, import group tensions, into the lives of students at school. And also we should avoid, to the extent that we can, becoming a kind of a venue for community divisions. One of the reasons, for example, that I thought it was important to fix the problem of not having a representative naming committee or renaming committee in the spring is that, it's obvious to me that when we bring people together from diverse backgrounds, they have conversations that are productive conversations that bring people together. And when we don't do that, then we risk division. I think in terms of, the lives of students within school, we want to do things like, provide opportunities for education about, say, the Asian American experience and the experience of immigrants. We want to provide students with opportunities to interact with each other that span, divisions of class and ethnicity and so forth. I think it's just part of our job in a sense, designing a school district that works for the students who spend, much of their days inside it.
Mm-hmm. That kind of speaks to maybe a curriculum or some sort of educational component. Is that something that the school board would really be able to suggest in the district? Sure.
I mean, in fact, we mandated a eugenics curriculum as part of the decision to remove the name of the eugenicists, from Jordan and Turman, because we wanted to make sure that students, not only understood the history of their schools, which is interesting, but also understood the dangers of a way of thinking that makes group identity and membership more important than, differences among individuals and similarities among individuals.
The district is facing a legal threat alleging that the board elections violate the California Voting Rights Act, and there's a deadline coming up on Monday to respond to that legal threat. How is the district planning to respond, and what do you think is the best approach to this legal threat?
So we are going to. I don't want to get in right now to the district's response because I don't want to get into a legal issue. I can tell you that this is going to be on the board agenda for the next board meeting, and we're going to have one of the district's attorneys explain the California Voting Rights Act and what the issues are involved in it, and we're going to have an opportunity for public input into the decision that's facing us, facing the district about how to respond.
But isn't your deadline before that meeting?
Well, the deadline is a deadline for the deadlines associated with this aren't hard deadlines in the sense that there's a penalty for not responding to the in a certain time. It
just a demand by the
there are caps associated with the district's liability. Mm-hmm. There's kind of safe harbors associated with those dates, but they're not deadlines in the sense that there's some statutory consequence that will befall us if we don't do it.
So the district was notified of this threat more than a month ago. It was discussed 2 weeks after the fact at a board meeting for the first time in closed session, no public opportunity to hear anything about it. That doesn't sound like the Ken Dauber pro-transparency guy that ran for office. Why, as the person who puts the agenda together with the superintendent, why didn't you put that on an open public agenda so that it could be sunshine?
Well, the first, to be honest with you, first of all, thank you for the compliment about the Ken Dauber in association with transparency. I appreciate that.
It's a way to twist that question around to a positive.
Well, let me say two things. One is that this is both a legal question and a sort of policy, political question. And I thought it was important to understand the legal context before we had a public discussion, because I wanted to avoid inadvertently doing something in public that was going to have consequences for the district's legal position. So I thought it was important to have that discussion first, and not to forestall a public discussion. I just said we're going to have that discussion, at the next public session. But the last thing we want to do is to inadvertently, close down options or create problems by not understanding our legal situation before we start having a conversation about it. So I think it was prudent in that case to do that. I would also say in terms of transparency that I have been a strong advocate of transparency, and I think the district has changed substantially in this regard. I'll go back to the OCR matter that we talked about. The previous board had a series of what I think were illegal closed sessions, to discuss this issue, illegal under the Brown Act. The board never discussed the issue of the resolution agreement in closed session.
In open session.
In closed session. We discussed it only in open session.
Okay.
We never discussed it.
You're talking about the more recent.
Yeah, I'm talking about more recently. After I joined it, we commissioned a full public report on how the district handled that 2016, I guess, Pali case in order to have a transparent discussion. There's no way that the previous board would have done that. I don't think any board has done anything like that in PAUSD. So I've really worked for transparency. In this particular situation, we are bringing transparency, but I thought it was prudent to begin with an understanding of the legal context.
I'm not quite sure I understand that, given how widespread this identical legal challenge has been in California. I mean, this has been litigated, it's been debated in many, many public agencies. This was not a surprise that this would come about. The only thing that makes us any different than anybody else would be the facts, the underlying facts, which aren't legal opinions. I just don't understand why your impulse wasn't to, as quickly as possible, make the public known, to make the public knowledgeable about this challenge.
So why did we schedule a closed session before an open session?
Yeah, or just schedule both. Schedule a closed session to be followed when you come out of closed session with an open public discussion, have the attorney present the issues as he felt was appropriate, and get people realizing that this was taking place. The notification of that closed session was so misleading that no one, except through our inquiries, would have known what even was being discussed in closed session.
Well, there are several issues there. If the notice was inadequate, then I apologize for that, and that's an issue that I will work with the staff on, as I think you probably know I have, on how closed session items are noticed. I think we're having increased transparency and accuracy around those, but I don't think that's always, we don't always get that right. The district doesn't always get that right. It's potentially a fair comment to say that we could have done a closed session followed immediately by an open session. I'll tell you that the thing that concerned me anyways is making sure that we didn't make statements, admissions, statements, speculations in open session that might cause us difficulty, when we needed to deal with the legal situation that we're in. And so to make sure that we got that closed session and heard that advice, and that we had time to understand it, and sort of do the next right thing to protect the district's interests, I thought that made sense. So that's why, I thought it was a reasonable decision.
Go ahead.
One area lacking transparency are union negotiations. The city is currently considering having a process where offers and counteroffers would be publicized during the negotiation. How far would you be comfortable for the district to go with providing greater transparency around union negotiations?
I mean, as far as we possibly can. So the district, I understand from the superintendent that the district and the union are discussing right now how to have a communications, joint communications out of those sessions. There are some limitations, I understand, on the district's ability to, for example, announce proposals that the union has not yet either accepted or rejected. So there's some legal issues, and the collective bargaining is a pretty legally regulated regime. But I would go as far as we possibly can. I mean, I'll be honest with you, One of my big regrets from my first term is my inability to convince the rest of the board to adopt the position that I took on the teacher's contract. And I suspect that I would have done better at that had these negotiations been happening in public, and we could have had an earlier, fuller debate about the implications of a smaller raise versus a larger raise. So, for reasons of transparency, but also I think just to get a better decision, I would be very happy to do that, and we're moving in that direction.
So is it your understanding that, for example, the proposal under discussion in closed negotiating meetings 3 years ago to adopt a 3-year contract, you were prevented by law from sunshining that while it was under negotiation? And would
When you say you, do you mean me, Ken Dauber, or me, or PAUSD?
Well,
I don't have.
if the law prevents one, then it would certainly be preventing the other. So
I'm trying to understand. No, I'm not asserting that the law.
Well, you
prevents
mentioned
it.
that there's.
I'm saying that there's some legal issues in what can be disclosed when during a negotiating process.
But that's an answerable question.
Yeah. I'm not. This isn't a reason not to do it. I'm saying I'm elaborating on my previous answer, which was to the limits of the law. Yes, we should do exactly what we should do as much as we possibly can.
Right. But the fact that you're here 4 years after having taken office and you don't know what how the law constrains the board in terms of sunshining, and we're in the middle of yet another negotiation, makes me wonder, just how committed you are to sunshining those negotiations.
Well, the answer to that is fully committed.
So we can assume that you're going to find out what the law prevents you and allows you to do?
Well, I mean, the direction that I will give, and that I think I doubt if there's any board members who would disagree with that, to the superintendent is figure out the most that we can do and do that. It's what I probably won't do is go and familiarize myself with collective bargaining law in California and figure it out for myself, because I'm likely to get it wrong, and it's certainly not the most effective use of my time. So, but I don't think there's
an interesting presentation to receive by the lawyers that we seem to have everywhere.
I know that the superintendent has the same goal. I don't think there's any doubt that we're going to move in this direction. I'm committed to moving in this direction. If I don't move in this direction and pretty quickly, then call me to account.
At the next election.
Well, or you have. I think you have.
Exactly.
Or write an editorial, or call me up, or say, hey.
I'm not sure that Don Austin would agree with the statement you've made, because he expressed some reluctance when we asked him these same questions a few weeks ago.
Okay, well, if that's the case, then
it seems like a topic that the questions are answerable as to what the parameters are, and that would make clear what the board is trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big distance between where we have been and where we need to be. Now, I can't tell you, with every sort of jot and tittle, what that distance consists of, because I don't. It's true, as you pointed out, I don't know all those rules. But I can tell you I'd like to go, I want to go, I'm committed to going as far as we can. Yeah. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's frankly going to help me out in the next time I need to make a case to the public about, why my position on the contract is has merit. So I'm completely committed to doing this.
I wanted to ask you about the Stanford general use permit. You initially recused yourself from discussions on that because your wife works at Stanford, and then you started participating again after Todd Collins sought advice from the FPPC, which said, and his wife is also employed by Stanford, and it said, it was fine for him to participate in these conversations. In response to a weekly question, another school board candidate, Stacey Ashland, said that, and this was about the ad hoc committee that the board formed to in relation to the GUP. She said, quote, "It's highly likely that you and Todd Collins will not negotiate in the best interests of the district, as doing so could negatively impact their spouse's employment or advancement at Stanford." What's your response to that?
Well, I think it's a statement without any basis in fact. And I was surprised to hear that she had said it to the point where I wrote to her and asked her if she had said it. I don't think it's appropriate to question the integrity of other candidates for the school board, which is what that essentially does. But more to the point, both Todd and I are advocating strongly for the district's interests in ensuring that that we receive that the district has an adequate funding stream for new students. And the pushback from the university on that idea has been pretty intense. So the idea that somehow we are not, that we're acting in the university's interest rather than in the district's interest in making that point, I think is just belied by the facts.
I want to address the teacher housing proposal from the county. Obviously, teacher retention is a grave concern in this area. Do you support the district funding that project? Do you think that's a good use of $600,000?
I don't yet support that because I think that we need to look at that proposal, which I give Supervisor Submitting a lot of credit for. I think it shows a lot of initiative, as I think I said to Elena a week ago. I think we need to look at that in a larger context of what are our options for teacher housing in Palo Alto, and generally for solving, the problem that underlies that, which is, adequate, cost-effective housing for teachers that enables them to work in the district and that supports our goals for recruiting and retaining excellent teachers. So I think rather than simply saying, yes, that somebody brought us an idea, we spent $600,000 of operating funds on that idea, I think the right thing to do is say, this is a problem, this is a potential solution, let's look at the space of other solutions, and then make a decision about where to invest our dollars and our attention.
Yeah, there have been a number of other possibilities, including the financing down payments, hooking up teachers with people who have ADUs or what have you in the area. Also building teacher housing. Do you have any preference for actual development of housing over some of the other possibilities for financing, helping teachers finance housing?
I think this is a question about what's going to work, honestly. And if we could solve the teacher housing problem with less expensive, methods that don't get the district into the business of being a landlord and don't consume district land, then that would be preferable. I suspect that we probably can't, and that at some point we're going to need to look at building teacher housing on district land. But until we see what those alternatives are and how practical they are, it's really hard to say which of those is going to be the best option.
The board has looked for some experiments to deal with the robust public participation that occurs in Palo Alto. That has included certain time constraints on commenting. It's also included a greater willingness to suspend the so-called two-meeting rule, which, contrary to what some people think, is not a state law. And I'm wondering, having dabbled in these various techniques, what's your conclusion about sort of further implementing more permanent reforms to the whole public participation process?
So the sort of values to balance here are public participation and input, which is really critical. These are public meetings, they're the public's meetings, and getting the board's and the district's business done, which is also in the public interest. That's the reason for having a school board. In terms of the time for public comment, I think it's a good idea to, when we have a very large number of speakers, to reduce the amount of time per speaker, because otherwise it's impossible to get other business done. And also, we're hearing a lot of input, and that input, tends to at some point be, consistent or even duplicative. So I think it makes sense to limit that. I think we might want to raise the sort of thresholds somewhat based on my observation.
You mean the time limit?
Yeah, like when the time limit kicks in. I think there's probably some jiggering to be done there, which we should do. The 2-meeting rule I really describe it as a do everything twice rule, and it's not a state law. In fact, I don't know of any other public body in the state of California that does this. So I just think as a tool for transparency, it's about the most expensive way that you could do that. And because it produces, it gets in the way of getting things done. I think it's also, counterproductive, because the fact is, if something can be decided on the first meeting, if everything gets discussed for 2 meetings, which meeting is it, right? So now, remember, the public has to figure out whether this is the first time or the second time. They have to figure out if the 2-meeting rule might be waived. They have to figure out if it's on the consent calendar, in which case the 2-meeting rule doesn't apply. So we've created a situation in which it's actually pretty unpredictable when things are actually going to get decided. Much easier, I think, to put out the agenda, which we do, and then people who are interested in it, just like for the city council and every other body, look at the agenda and know when something is going to be decided and come. If something really should take 2 meetings, then we can take 2 meetings. We can decide, for example, the MOU with the police department wasn't ready to be decided. We didn't need a 2-meeting rule in order to decide, we're not ready to decide that. We could see that in prospect when we make up the agenda, or we could decide to table it based on what we're hearing and learning from the community. So I just think it has very few benefits and a lot of costs.
So what's the next step in kind of resolving this?
The next step is for me to convince 2 other board members of that perspective.
To change the board policy.
To change the board policy. I mean, what we are doing now is to, one of the objections, which I think is legitimate, is if we don't get our agenda out until the Friday before the meeting, then, it isn't a whole lot of time for people to understand what's happening and to gather their own thoughts and to mobilize support if they want to. So we're working on getting a draft version of the agenda out, the agenda setting committee meeting the day after the board meeting, and then getting that agenda out no later than the Friday with the superintendent's board report.
The Friday.
That Friday.
10 days before.
10 days before the next meeting. Right. If we do that, and do that effectively, and maybe also make the agenda easier to find. So, for example, put a link to it on the, homepage of the district. Then I think that those legitimate objections we'll have dealt with, and we can move forward with an experiment on the 2-meeting rule. And I think what we'll probably wind up with is an experiment, and then if that goes well, a change. At least that's how I hope we proceed.
So would that have to go through the board policy review committee to do the experiment, or would you just put it on the agenda to discuss and decide on at a meeting?
I don't think it probably needs to go to the BPRC because it's a pretty simple change, and we've discussed this many times at the board level. So I think we could probably craft it and at a board meeting and move forward with it.
And you expect to do this?
Well, so what we said is that we
don't know that you can get 2 more votes because you can't talk to 2 other board members.
Well, we've talked about this enough so that I see some willingness emerging. What we said at the last meeting is that we would, make these sort of changes in the agenda posting and so forth, and then revisit this at our next board retreat in January. And so I'm hoping at that point we'll say, oh yeah, that has worked. Let's now take the next step.
Another quick transparency question. The district has a pretty significant backlog of Public Records Act requests. How do you plan to address that in the rest of your term and if you're reelected?
Well, the district needs to be compliant with the Public Records Act. And so having requests that have been outstanding for months and, over a year, I think some of the weeklies requests have been outstanding.
That's right.
So that's not acceptable. That's feedback I've given to the superintendent and prior superintendents. I think there's a variety of things that staff can do. I would frankly rather direct them to the end goal rather than to particular mechanisms. But some things that I think will be productive are, working with requesters to, if requesters are willing, to understand, what would be responsive but less burdensome. There's some possibility of technical solutions to the extent that what we're looking at is, duplicate emails. So, costs $1 a page, or $1.33, I think is the estimate that I saw most recently, to redact a page. So it's really dumb to do that, over and over again for the same document. We also have some of the Public Records Act requests in front of us are really difficult. One of, I think, Kathy Jordan, for example, community member and school board candidate, has one request for Carolyn Benfield's communications. She's the Palo Alto school secretary for 2 years that has yielded 100,000 pages of documents. Right? There's no way I think that it makes sense for the district to spend $133,000 on a school secretary's communications over a period of 2 years. So I think we need to figure out, how it is that we can, and to the extent that we have requests like that are getting in the way of requests that have, some that are smaller and maybe have more clear public interest involved in them. I think we need to figure out how to sort those kinds of things out because we have a system now that clearly is not producing what it needs to.
You've been wrestling with this problem for years. What's going to actually cause the trigger to be pulled on a solution? I mean, at some point, you got to solve this problem. Or do you just wait for it to be sued, basically, and let a court order the district or somehow figure out how to handle these requests?
Well, I think that we've had some discussion about this at the board level. For example, we've discussed, and I think Elena reported this, that we've discussed whether some of these requests are so burdensome in relation to the public interest that they present that the appropriate response is to not produce the records, particularly if the requester refuses to have a discussion about what they're actually looking for. And the case that I just mentioned to you, I think, is probably one of those cases. So I think we need to take that seriously and actually do that, and do it in a way that's legally compliant and that really does properly.
Or that'll be settled by a court in terms of.
Obviously
there isn't a lot of precedent.
Right. Obviously, just from a sort of fiduciary perspective as a trustee, it might well make more sense to test our obligations that way than comply and spend, an enormous number of public dollars. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pages from Kathy Jordan, by herself. That's not responsible, either as a trustee or certainly as a trustee to respond to those simply by, hiring a raft of people and paying them, $1 million to address that.
I think we're out of time. Thank you very much, Ken. It's a good conversation, and thanks for coming in.
Yeah.